May I ask you to cease conversation so I can introduce our final speaker of the day. We have two more sessions. One is President Václav Klaus, and I will introduce him in a moment. And after him, there will be a brief panel discussion, which all members of all speakers will take questions, but finalize their remarks, give their final remarks, I should say. I'd like to introduce President Václav Klaus. It's obviously the case that, as the old saying goes, he needs no introduction. We all know who he is and what he's done. But I think it is worth saying that among the speakers today, he is someone who has combined both the theoretical grasp of the important subjects, which Peter Bauer spent his life mastering, but has also, as a statesman, put those ideas into effect. And that's not always a good recipe for an economist. Not all economists have proved to be successful statesmen, but President Klaus did so in two important ways. The first, and you won't be surprised by this perhaps, was that he managed to produce out of the chaos and the wasteland of post-communist Central Europe an extraordinarily successful modern market economy, and it did so in a relatively short period of time. Not without difficulties, of course, but overall with enormous success. And secondly, again, post-communist Europe has been plagued by national divisions, and he was successful in bringing about the Velvet Divorce, which I believe, given all the difficulties of nations that break up into smaller nations, I believe there are only two cases of a essentially very successful Velvet Divorce. One is the divorce between Sweden and Norway at the beginning of the 20th century, and the second is the divorce between Czech Republic, Czechia, and Slovakia in Mr. Klaus's time. Now, the interesting feature of that divorce is that before it happened, it was generally expected by many people that although the Czechs would prosper, the Slovaks were bound to suffer badly because of the huge backlog of industry which wasn't producing goods for the market. And that was a reasonable expectation. But the fact is, when the Czechs stopped sending Czechs to the Slovaks found that they adapted very quickly to the necessities of life, and the Slovak economy turned around with surprising speed. So out of a divided and difficult country, you produced two successful independent ones, and I think very few people have, in a sense, quite grasped that second success, though the first is generally known. So you're in a better position than anyone who's spoken so far, as both an observer, an economist of economic and political life, but as a successful practitioner as well. Great pleasure. I introduce President Klaus.
John, many thanks for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for the invitation. I take it as a great idea to organize this conference. Peter Bauer deserves it. And I believe that the debate today proves that. My task at almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon now is rather difficult. I hope you don't expect from the last speaker to come with anything new and interesting. Everything has already been said, and I can offer perhaps a slightly different perspective of a former politician and a former economist. As a side remark, this morning I was puzzled when Peter Bauer was called an unorthodox economist. It's surprising. It depends on the definition of orthodoxy. Peter Bauer respected the economic orthodoxy properly defined, and he was a true believer in the old-fashioned economic theory. So when someone mentioned here Raoul Prebisch and Swedish guy Myrdal, were they orthodox or unorthodox? I would say that they were unorthodox, and Peter Bauer was an orthodox economist. This is something which should be put very, very strongly. I don't pretend to be an expert on Peter Bauer. That's my first remark. I am not a specialist in the field of development economics either. I met Peter Bauer shortly, twice or three times at international conferences, probably at Mont Pelerin Society. We just exchanged a few friendly words. One 16-year-old story deserves to be mentioned. At that moment, 16 years ago, Cato Institute decided to start awarding the Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty. I was, together with Margaret Thatcher, Edward Crane, John Blundell, Rose Friedman, the wife of Milton, and a few others, appointed to be a member of the International Selection Committee. And I am proud to be able to say now that I didn't hesitate 1 second, and from the suggested list of candidates, immediately picked up Peter Bauer, which is something which should be mentioned this afternoon. Margaret Thatcher told me later that she did the same. That's just the more pleasant part of the story. This is not the end of the story. I arrived to Washington, D.C. the night before the planned celebration and was told, many others as well, that Peter Bauer died a few days ago. It was a very sad and strange moment for me and for all those who came from all over the world. The prize was, of course, awarded, but instead of listening to Peter Bauer's speech, we participated collectively in an unplanned conversation with Milton Friedman. So that's my special story connected with Peter Bauer. I have never worked in the field of development economics on a condition we don't consider the relatively developed and highly industrialized centrally planned communist economies as the Czech Republic, the developing countries, which I don't consider. Nevertheless, the economists in those countries were, together with Peter Bauer, convinced of the necessity of a fundamental systemic change, of the liberalization and deregulation of our economies, of the introduction of free markets, of unregulated prices and proper incentives. In this respect, we considered Peter Bauer our colleague, our implicit colleague in promoting such ideas. If I am not wrong, he hasn't made a strong statement about communist or post-communist countries. Please correct me if I am wrong in this respect. When we, decades ago, followed Peter Bauer's powerful attack on foreign aid, we also fully agreed. We understood how irrational the whole idea of foreign aid was. Our countries had very frustrating experience with helping some politically selected developing countries. And we understood quite well that our problem was not the lack of money or of capital, but our economic system. It's a trivial conclusion. Our a prioristic criticism of foreign aid, of aid organized by governments and by foreign aid lobbyists in international financial institutions, was absolute. So we felt very strongly the hypocrisy of this endeavor, and we knew that no one in the world has criticized this hypocrisy so eloquently and efficiently as Peter Bauer. The fall of communism offered us additional convincing arguments. My country was very lucky not to get any foreign aid in that crucial moment. First, we didn't ask for it, and I would dare to argue we didn't need it. In addition to it, we got a chance to follow an almost controlled laboratory experiment, which we don't have very often in social sciences. Controlled laboratory experiment done with our neighbor country, with the GDR, with the German Democratic Republic. The huge amounts of money which have been flowing into this country for more than a quarter of the century could not compensate for the absence of any transformation process there. And I wrote some articles and made some speeches about it, which are available. So that was a huge experiment for us. East Germany has been getting incredible amount of money. I remember once I had Schröder as German chancellor in my office many years ago, and I told him, "Look, I just checked in your German statistics how much you pay yearly inter-German fiscal transfers," and I said 150 billion Deutsche Mark, and he told me, "Oh no, it's much more. We just try to put it in another part of the budget, not to make it so visible." And I made a point, Mr. Chancellor, this amount of money you send annually to GDR, even now, is approximately the GDP of the Czech Republic just now. Can you imagine, I told him, can you imagine that we Czechs produce one GDP, and on the Christmas Eve we got as a good gift another GDP? This is exactly how you are destroying East Germany by this crazy amount of money. So this is just a side remark. We got another convincing experience in recent years, mentioned by Professor Bott, mentioned by Alberto, the EU inter-country financial transfers. I am convinced, and almost don't want to lose my time arguing why, I am convinced that it has been convincingly proved how unproductive, useless, and dangerous the current EU foreign aid in reality is. It is first, it's almost irrelevant economically. I am surprised when Professor Bott and even Alberto speak about infrastructure investments. Nothing like comes to the Czech Republic. Irrelevant, unnecessary, quasi-economic project, but not really infrastructure investments. And as was mentioned already here, and it evidently contributes to the corruption atmosphere in today's Europe. Foreign grants, subsidies, aid lead to the, as was mentioned several times today, lead to the politicization of economic life, which was one of well-known Peter Bauer's arguments. Our post-communist transformation was based on the radical desubsidization of our economies. And we were successful in this respect. Entering the EU, we occurred again in a heavily subsidized economy. It is not a help. I always argue that we don't need the EU money. The net balance effect is, in my understanding, a negative one. I dare claim that I understood and accepted Peter Bauer's ideas from the very beginning. I have been always stressing that we need trade, not aid. Trivial argument. Peter Bauer was convinced and tried to prove it in his early academic works that people in Malaysia and West Africa reacted to prices and incentives, however poor they were. Strong argument. He argued that they behaved as homo economicus, that they intuitively knew how to react to market incentives, and that they didn't need any education in this respect. Another Peter Bauer's very strong argument, that they especially don't need, as teachers, any advisors, consultants, bureaucrats from international financial institutions with their built-in foreign aid mentality. We went through the same debate after the fall of communism. The anti-Peter Bauers of all stripes and colors were coming, hundreds of them, into our countries. And I'm sure Hungarians have the same experience, and were telling us that the people in communist countries don't understand markets, and that they would need not years, but decades to learn it. I strongly disagreed at the very beginning. I was convinced that what the people in former communist countries needed was a systemic change, not any schooling done by the World Bank and any other experts. But this was exactly what the people in these institutions wanted to do. As an economist, I have to admit that it was quite understandable. Those people also reacted to incentives. They wanted to maximize their own income, not the wealth of such nations as Hungary and Czechoslovakia. So elementary, necessary to stress. We were, after the fall of communism, we were, of course, very happy to live suddenly with open borders after decades of the existence of the Iron Curtain. But I remember that at one moment I threatened to start issuing entry visas for one special group of visitors, for foreign advisors and investment bankers. It was impossible to lose our precious time for entertaining all of them who decided to come to my... Really, this is true. Several weeks after becoming the Minister of Finance, I had to create a special small department in the Ministry of Finance, several people able to speak English, and so to entertain the foreign advisors. You know, that was a terrible experience, and we did need it, really. So I threatened to start issuing entry visas. At the very beginning, we wrongly believed in a positive and productive mission of some of these institutions. My first letter abroad, which I sent as a Minister of Finance in January 1919, 3 weeks after entering my office, the first letter abroad asked the IMF and the World Bank to allow us to re-enter these institutions, to re-enter because my country was in 1944 in Bretton Woods, one of the founding fathers of both the Bretton Woods institutions. We succeeded in this effort very rapidly in 7 months, but these institutions were not very helpful. We didn't ask for the IMF loans, with the exception of a small standby loan at the very beginning, and we were not able to find projects to be financed by the World Bank. This is unique for our country. I think it's different in Hungary. I remember making a small scandal in Washington, D.C., when I refused to accept the technical assistance loan from the World Bank. Big scandal. And I made a comment at a big conference in the World Bank. I said, I am not ready to pay hard money for soft advice. And Milton Friedman later dubbed it as the Klaus law, that I'm not ready to to pay hard money for self-advice. This is something I think absolutely crucial. So the developments after the fall of communism in our part of the world confirmed Peter Bauer's views. It was discussed here already. He was a very sophisticated person, but his economic theory was relatively simple. He regarded himself primarily as an applied economist, which is something I share. I always say that my position in the science of economics is on the demand side, not on the supply side. That's a very important statement. I'm afraid that most economists don't think in those terms. They believe that they are on the supply side, which is definitely not true. No, I'm not looking at Professor Klaus. His economics was based on relatively few basic but powerful principles, which is sufficient. He didn't need sophisticated mathematical and econometric models for describing the economic reality and for giving useful economic advice, economic recommendations. He believed in the market. He believed in the market economy. Those who want to play the market or to replace the market needed sophisticated models. He didn't. They needed sophisticated models mostly to hide their ignorance. He only wanted to apply the elementary economic principles to problems in the real world. With this approach, he couldn't get the Nobel Prize, but he could get the Milton Friedman Award. I recommend to everyone to reread his 1987 Cato Journal article, The Disregard of Realities. Some of you, I am sure, know it, which is absolutely crucial, and his famous, it was mentioned here, his famous point about the parable of emperor's new clothes. He said that here these are new clothes, but all too often there is no emperor within, which is an excellent, of course, an excellent point. 1987 Cato Journal article. His views are as relevant now as they were 70 years ago. His criticism of central planning, nicknamed regulation today, of protectionism and of foreign aid is much needed again. His belief in liberty and markets as well. It is probably much worse now in the brave new world of political correctness, of human rightism, of the belief in information technologies, of the EU and other supranational organizations than it used to be in the past. I could develop many points from Peter Bauer's work. I'm surprised that no one quoted his famous statement in 1957, Economic Analysis and Policy in Underdeveloped Countries, when he said, "My position is much influenced by my dislike of policies or measures which are likely to increase men's power over men, that is, to increase the control of groups or individuals over their fellow men." This is for me a formulation in the tradition of great classical liberals, and we don't see them among us these days. Again, it was not mentioned here. I was immensely impressed by the arguments he used when rejecting the fashionable concept of a vicious circle of poverty mentioned by Alberto. His well-known phrases, to have money is I quote, "to have money is the result of economic achievement, not its precondition." If the notion of the vicious circle of poverty were valid, mankind would still be living in the old Stone Age. It should be repeated again and again. 70 years ago, he famously coined the phrase that capital is created in the process of development rather than that development is the function of capital, and so on and so on. I could mention his other famous phrases and sentences. We should, for example, what bothers me very much, in the dangerous era of Thomas Piketty, of this crazy French guy, you know, in this era we should mention his distinguishing, mentioned here, between inequality and differences. Famous Peter Bauer statement. For Peter Bauer, the latter term is better because it is, I quote, more analytical and less emotive. Again, very, very strong argument. We should also mention his pointing out the importance of trade for economic development, well known. I like his stressing the need to restate the obvious. His criticism of the exhibitionist guilt felt in the Western world. His emphasizing of the importance of non-economic variables, etc., etc. But we don't have time for it now. He was a great economist. We were very much enriched by his ideas. Thank you for your attention. You should come here.
President Klaus, thank you. That was marvelous. Now I'm going to take two quick questions for the President, and then I'm going to ask all of the speakers to take positions on the panel, and we'll go and we'll make final statements and take more questions. And do I have a question? Ah, yes. Hang on a second while we get to the... Good. This gentleman here.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed the speech immensely. Mr. President, you mentioned the importance of healthy nationalism in your first comment today. I think there's someone who agrees with you in the White House who has recently applied, or is in the process of applying tariffs on aluminum and steel. You also mentioned, and Bauer also emphasized the importance of trade, of free trade. I'm interested in your views and what you think his views would be on the current situation, this trade issue between U.S. and China.
That would be a good topic for the whole afternoon session and discussion. I don't want to trivialize it by saying in one sentence, yes, yes, and no. As I commented this morning, you know, I take the nation state as an important, genuine entity of human organization. And all those quasi-classical liberals who preach total free migration, in my understanding, are missing the point, and they don't understand the real substance of social organization. So I think that the nation state has a right to do some things, and I totally disagree with the free gates to Europe made by Angela Merkel and all the others. And of course, I am for trade, not aid, and I am very much in favor of trade liberalization in all possible respects. But I can imagine, I'm not sure about the United States of America, and I don't want to comment on Mr. Trump ideas. I really I'm a free market economist. Nevertheless, I think that we shouldn't liquidate the term nation state from our vocabulary. That's my argument.
Thank you. I think I'm right in saying that one of the founders of the Chicago School, Frank Knight, distinguished between free trade in goods and services and free trade in people. But you certainly can claim Montpellierian support, universal.
I must tell you that I was the very darling person in the Montpellierin society till very recently. They don't like those statements of mine on the one hand, and they are the main enemies of populism. And I defend the populists in Europe because they are the hopeless people who have no chance to say anything critical to the European Union, and the Montpellierians don't like me for that.
Well, I think we have to deal with the fact, on another occasion, we have to try to define what the words populism, liberalism, and conservatism and democracy, liberal democracy, I should say, mean, because obviously there are contrasting and...
No, John, we in the communist era, we opposed the term people's democracy, you know. And so I'm always attacking the adjectives. So liberal democracy is wrong as well. All those adjectives are wrong, really. Don't use the term.
Well, I mean, we can't get into a theoretical debate between us here because I'm the chairman and I'm supposed to be neutral. So I'm going to ask for another question. There's a gentleman here.
I commend you for common sense, because I think that's what's missing on the other side of the argument. And also Peter Bauer had it, evidently. I like to reflect on my background. I was a Swiss banker in New York, and there were these young gentlemen, young Turk Americans came, and they didn't know the 5 C's of credit, what is a good credit and what isn't. And they got my bank into a $50 billion deficit, almost broke the famous Swiss bank, almost went into bankruptcy as a result. So I thank you. That was just my comment.
Any more questions?
This gentleman, this young man.
I'm sorry, I see you.
Thank you very much. I'm Bauer from Hungary. And I liked very much what you spoke about EU funds. I worked for Development Agency of Hungary for ages, so I have a lot of stories similar to yours. But what I see, that ideas, what you said, are widespread in economic clubs. When we are sitting in a ministry, it's this idea even should be taken in the guardrobe when I enter. My question, what do you think, what can be the political idea to make this idea not to accept cohesion funds money livable or acceptable in real political debates, or how it happened in Czech Republic? How could it be solved?
How to make a change? You know? You must organize in all EU member countries for people like your Prime Minister or me to win the elections. That's the easy solution, how to arrange it. Everything else is just a theoretical argument with just no real substance and meaning.
I'm going to, at this point, thank you, President Klaus.